And welcome to episode 75. Curtis is back with us here today. It's been a while. How have you been?
I just got over being sick, so
Yeah.
it's
Um,
spring break. I'm just kind of relaxing. Started a new job 2 days ago. You know,
what do you do now?
my official title is bitch boy. No, I do just about everything that needs to be done for the New Mexico Bureau of Mining and Geology. And so, I move heavy boxes. I mail out publications. I restock publications. I organize, restock topographic maps.
So,
Pretty cool stuff.
so basically, a lot of physical stuff and everything else.
Yeah, it's kind of a jack of all trades job because I do publications and sales. I do phone work. I do computer work, heavy lifting, whatever they need done.
That's
Making coffee.
so. Hopefully, this is the door into something a little bit better.
Actually, I
That
don't mind this job, but yeah, I mean it's just it's a little school job, campus related job that I'll do until I'm done here in December.
well, that's pretty cool. And you and this goes along with your background. You're a lover of nature. You like going to parks, landmarks, your extensive coursework,
Mm-hmm.
and all of the related areas. And you kind of brought this to my attention, and um, and I've kind of noticed kind of a trend of kind of just general disrespect coming across, and so what you brought to my attention is not just that story in Akron, Ohio, where the guy's just taking a dump on people's cars at random, because at least that can be cleaned off easily. Imagine
Yeah.
doing that in, say, a national park or on a national landmark.
Oh,
And
I'm sure it's been tried. I wouldn't try it at the National Mall though. They have good security, or so I've been told.
good God. Um, so apparently, um, this is something you're passionate about, and as somebody who went to ended their career at UCM in history, this kind of puzzles me as to why people would do something like this too. But there's been a trend of national parks, landmarks, not here, just here in the U.S., around the world too, that have been kind of vandalized.
I mean, one could quickly interject in there. ISIS demolishing the ancient city of Nimrud is in itself an act of vandalism against a landmark, a World Heritage Site. So, yeah, it's happening a lot by a lot of different groups or a lot of different individuals.
And the unfortunate part, and and unfortunately with what ISIS is doing and everything else, it's basically war. It sucks, but it's war. Um, the cases that we're going to talk about, it's people being careless, not really thinking things out, people who should know better, and they do it anyway. And I would not want to be somebody guarding these things because I would probably lose my job after strangling somebody.
Well,
Um,
actually, that's an important part to bring up is that a lot of the reason this is happening is because park funding is at an all-time low, and there aren't people to be patrolling these areas. And so it is a lot easier for people to get out there and vandalize.
ouch. So one such incident is this happened across 4 states. Somebody going by the online persona of Creepy Things. Where did people come up with these names? It was identified as 21-year-old Casey Knockett. She she appears to be cooperating with the Oregon authorities. She did this in 4 states: Yosemite National Park, Death Valley National Park, Joshua Tree National Park, right in California, near your neck of the woods, Rocky Mountain National Park, and Colorado National Monument in Colorado, later Lake National Park in Oregon, Zion National Park, and Canyonlands National Park in Utah. And apparently what she was doing is doing all these things, and not even in chalk too. That's the bad part. It's acrylics, and it would get posted on Instagram, and a lot of people would get upset with this, and understandably so. So apparently they're cooperating with authorities now, according to a local Oregon media outlet. Normally stuff like this carries about a $5,000 fine and a year in prison, but with national landmarks, if vandalism is extensive enough, that could be a felony right there.
Yeah.
So, first of all, you're a big fan of Joshua National Tree Park. Am I correct?
Oh yeah, Joshua Tree is like that. It's my park, and I haven't been to it yet, and it's the one I need to go to, what I most want to go to. Still haven't been, but hopefully we'll get there.
But this is not the only person that's done this. Some guy named Mr. Andre has been doing this as well.
Yeah, he's a well-known street artist in Europe, I believe. I don't follow street art at all, so I didn't know who the hell this guy was. But there was a lot of... This was a really interesting story because there was data hidden inside of his Instagram account from his photographs that allowed them to prove he had taken the pictures inside the park. Originally, he was claiming, oh no, it's a rock outside the park. But they were actually able to map out exactly where he was in the park with GPS using his Instagram account, and then he was kind of left holding the bag because he was inside the park.
And yeah, so people keep forgetting about the metadata inside of their photos. Yeah. So they're getting themselves caught. And there's also the Saguaro incident as well. Would you like to elaborate on that?
So Saguaro, this is kind of a little bit of a long discussion with Saguaro National Park. Much like Oregon Pipe Cactus National Park, Saguaro is in Tucson, and it's very close to the border. And being that we have problems with our border, there tends to be a lot of gang-related vandalism in those two parks.
Ooh.
And in Saguaro, it's come in the form of a lot of graffiti painting of gang signs, gang symbols, what have you, on the actual cactuses themselves. Obviously, painting on cactuses is not the same as if you were to go outside and paint on an oak tree. The saguaro cactus is very delicate. It is very easy to damage it. It is extremely difficult to clean. With the saguaro incidents, they had a young, I believe it was a local resident who was painting different gang graffiti on several of the older cacti in the park, and the saguaro can live to be 50, 60, 70 years old. They grow very large, beautiful, beautiful cacti. And the problem was that they had to call in a company from Europe to clean out these cacti, or to try to clean off the cacti, because this was like the only company in the world that specialized in cleaning cactus. that's how difficult it was to clean them. And I think some of them were damaged. I think a couple of them, the cacti species, the individual specimens, were killed as a result of trying to clean them. There wasn't anything they could do. I think most of them did get cleaned, at least to the point where the nasty signs and symbols were not on them anymore. But you know,
And and again, with gang warfare, they're not going to care, and I think that's very, very sad.
well, there's some contention as to whether or not this was, you know, I myself have a hard time believing that a gang in, say, Tucson or Phoenix is going to tell its members to go out and paint on cactuses. I think they're concerned with much more, you know, heavy stuff to them. And I have a feeling that this was a kid who wished to be in one of those gangs, who maybe associated himself as in gang culture in general. Just going out and doing this is, you know, look, I'm in the gang. I can throw their gang signs. I'm just like they are. I'm cool. I'm hip, or whatever it is he wanted. I really have a hard time believing that this specific incident had anything at all to do with the gangs. You know, like, oh, let's go deface some parks. I think they've got different concerns. You know, but
it's still very, very, very sad, and I hope they get caught.
Well, I think in the case of the Saguaro incident happened in June of 2013, and I'm fairly certain that the kid was prosecuted. I believe he was fined the max fine, which was like $20,000, and I believe he had I can't really find it at the moment, but I think he did 2 years in juvenile detention with like 6 months time served for community service or something like that. So there definitely was a punishment awarded in that case. For the creepy things, national parks across the Southwest defacement tour that this young lady from New York went on this past year, I am not aware of her actually receiving any punishment for it yet. I know that there's a lot of evidence against her, and that I think it's going to be very hard for her to win her case. But as far as it goes, I think she's still tied up in legalese at the moment, and that there hasn't been a verdict in that case.
And the bad part is, this hasn't just happened in the U.S. There's been other places around the world. Recently, as this year, a couple was caught in Italy, etching their initials onto the Roman Colosseum.
Yeah.
And they weren't the only ones. Past November was Russian tourists who got caught. So, and it's happened at Easter Island in 2008 when a Finnish tourist, Marko Kolju, was caught trying to get a piece of the statues, and Mayor Edmundsbo called for his ear. Mm-hmm. A Chinese teenager got caught in 2013 etching Xing Shenhao was here, etching that onto the walls of Egypt's Luxor temple, and then Stonehenge in 2008, some people were attempting to take pieces of the temple with them, which officials apparently were okay with in the past. I don't know why, but not anymore. So,
with Stonehenge, I have some trouble. I'm not sure where that quote came from, but I know for a fact that it has been illegal to take anything from Stonehenge since 1974. I don't know if this was from prior to that, maybe, but 1974 is when the British Archaeology Association put the law down on that to protect the site.
Washington Post was this all these things came from the Washington Post, so more than likely they meant from before that period that they
Yeah.
were kind of a little bit lax on that, and then they're like, no, we better not do that anymore.
Yeah, there was a big movement in the 1950s and 60s to kind of preserve sites. Traditionally, archaeology has had a torrid history with basically um, important things being removed from sites of interest with no protection placed upon them, and so you see this a lot in the American Southwest, places like Hovenweep National Monument and Mesa Verde and Chaco Canyon, where there was a lot of where the park is related to the Native American history there, where a lot of pottery and jewelry was drug out of there by the cartloads in the early 1900s, and so.
So, what you mentioned that lack of funding meant lack of people watching the stuff,
Yeah.
meaning more people getting away with stuff. But I'm of a different mind on a lot of things. I look at public schools and realize that people keep trying to throw money at it, and I'm like, this is going to take more than just money. It's going to take people caring too.
Well, what I mean by that is that the funding in the Park Service is so bad, and I'll give you a really great example. Petroglyph National Monument, I believe, which is up here in Albuquerque, in the middle of downtown Albuquerque, basically on the Rio Grande River, is still closed to the public because people were etching and destroying the petroglyphs so much. And the Park Service couldn't afford to hire more than 2 people to control a park that was several, dozen square miles in land coverage. 2 people to patrol a park is not enough to prevent those kinds of issues from happening. It is very, very difficult also to get people into the law enforcement side of park rangering, especially here in the Southwest. I mentioned Oregon Pipe Cactus National Monument earlier, which is a border park in Arizona, southern Arizona, a couple of hours south and west of Tucson, where 39 park rangers have been murdered by Mexican drug cartels who were crossing over through the park carrying their paraphernalia in the past 10 years. And I believe there are other instances in other Southwest parks where rangers have been either shot at or have been wounded. I'm not aware of any other fatalities in the Southwest outside of the Oregon Pipe area because that park is literally on the border with Mexico and the U.S. But, it's not combining having people who don't want to do the jobs with not having enough money to hire the jobs. Obviously, having 50 park rangers wouldn't solve the problem, but it would make it a lot harder for people to get away with it. As you were going to say, having people understand why you shouldn't do this is also a very important thing. And the thing about parks and monuments is that when these incidents happen, you do see a rally. You do see a rally from the community. Where the community comes together by and large and shows a lot of outrage, and you get what that tells me is that 99% of people know you shouldn't do this. You're talking about that bottom 1% of the people who don't care. Obviously they probably know you shouldn't do it either, but they don't care. And I think you'll never be able to get rid of that 100%, but by and large, for now, there's nothing that signals to me that this is some kind of growing problem. I think it's becoming more covered here in the Southwest as we began to, there's this whole relationship between parks and monuments and the economy. And wherever you have parks and monuments, you have lots of money because you have the tourist trade. And so the people in these places, Albuquerque or in Moab, Utah, or outside of Grand Canyon, Flagstaff, they want to protect their monuments and parks from this stuff because they want the tourists to keep coming because that, helps the local economy out and gives them a reason to make a living there. So You definitely see a lot of lashback against the behavior. I think the problem is that um, we're sitting at that crossroads of how do you deal with that last vestige of people who either don't care that they're breaking the law, or or something like that.
And and that's a very very good question. Because you also have people who are careless, and you shared the link with the National Parks Traveler website
Yeah,
where it's this, this is why rangers get gray hair,
yeah.
because people do stupid things.
Um, yeah, I mean, it's so there's this weird dichotomy. There are a couple of different kinds of people when it comes to dealing with national parks. And both of them are under the whole category of people who love those parks, who love nature, who love everything about them. But then you have these two camps. You have this one camp that is, you know, go away. We don't want more people in the parks. There are too many people coming to the parks. There's so many people coming to the parks that they're damaging them just by the fact that they're there. And then you also have the other camp that's like, no, that's amazing. We want more people in the parks. That's what they're here. They're here to be used. We want more people coming in. This is why they were created. So it's good that they're being used. And of course, both sides have merit and truth, and both sides have that other side of the sword. Where it's like, well, yeah, if you've got more people coming to the parks, that means you're going to see more instances of actual vandalism, just on principle. But there is going to be damage to the park just on general. There's a lot of people there using it, walking, treading, what have you. Um, Accidents happen, people fall, deaths happen. So with increased use comes increased risk, and at the same time. Um,
And people who apparently refuse to wear spiked shoes walking trails that are nice and icy.
right, exactly. We had last year when I visited the Grand Canyon for the first time, 2 days, or no, was it one day before my friends and I got there? A man had fallen off the south rim and died because he was trying to get a hat. And it's my dad always says, buy another hat. You don't need to try to crawl over the side of a canyon to get a hat. And I mean, he fell 400 feet to his death.
Oh,
It's very sad thing to have happen. But these kinds of things do happen, and I don't think you'll ever fully be able to put an end to these kinds of problems. But I think that if people are aware, if you, for example, if you're watching this right now, and if you go to parks often or monuments, and you see people defacing things, just report it to the ranger station. You don't even have to call. You don't have to, just when you get to the ranger station, just say, I saw somebody on this such and such trail, and this is what they were wearing. This is the description of the person, and this is what they were carving into the rock or painting on the rock. And the Park Service will take care of it. In most cases, they do get convictions. So this is one crime area that sees a lot of punishment for what's happening when people vandalize.
so you mentioned that there were people who, in archaeology, wanted to preserve these sites. In our notes that we're looking at, John Muir, the father of national parks. For him, we wouldn't really have the idea of national parks, would we?
No, Muir is one of those human beings that I have to stop sometimes and go, how can the human species produce something as vile as Adolf Hitler, but then also turn around and produce someone as amazing as John Muir was? He was, a little background for you on him, he was a Scottish-born young man. His family immigrated to Wisconsin in the middle 1800s. His father was a very violent man. He was I believe he was a Protestant minister, and he used to beat John as a child when he would fail to recite a line from the Bible, if he recited it incorrectly, he would beat him. So that by the age of 11, John Muir was able to actually recite about 3/4 of the Old Testament and the entire New Testament by heart without reading it word for word. He was an incredibly gifted and brilliant young man. He attended the University of Wisconsin. He got honors degrees in geology and botany, and he went to work in a factory. And there was an accident. A tool flipped up and hit him in the eyes. He was working as manager. He was showing a new person how to fix a machine, and it hit him in the eyes, and he was blinded for about 6 weeks. He had to spend 6 weeks in a dark room, and he was never sure if his sight was coming back. It did come back, and when he got out of the bandages and everything, he decided that he was going to leave the city, and he was going to walk to the mouth of the Amazon River in South America and Brazil, build a raft, and sail up its length. And he actually made it from Wisconsin to the Florida Keys, where he got a fever, and it's pretty well established. I think it was malaria. And he decided, well, maybe I'd better not go to the Amazon in this condition. So he ended up taking a boat to California, and we're lucky that he did, because he got a job herding sheep for a gentleman in the valley outside of San Francisco, and ended up going up into the high Sierra Nevadas, and ended up finding the area that we now call today the Yosemite National Park. And he explored most of that area and became such an advocate for it that he lobbied the California State Legislature to set it aside as preserved land. It was the first in U.S. history. Eventually, he argued for what he originally had called a nation's park for the Yosemite, and the idea really grew out of his tireless work. He was an amazingly gifted writer, and his ability to describe the park in detail in leaflets and pamphlets was just incredible. But on top of that, he had all these weird insights. Having grown up in that very violent young adulthood that he had been in, this idea of being out in nature created in him almost some kind of new form of Christianity for him, one that was not rooted in violence or the strictness that his father had been such an advocate for, but one that was actually rooted specifically in nature. Like some of his quotes that I think kind of echo, as I was saying earlier, the kind of person he was. There was one in particular. Let me see if I can find it here real quick. Let's see. He kind of points out. He says that this may give you some insight into how he was thinking in his older age. He would say, one might as well dam for water tanks the people's cathedrals and churches, because no holier temple has ever been consecrated by the heart of man. He's talking about nature. And so what this quote is actually a reference to is that he was in the Yosemite after it had become established as a park. And there was another person there with him, and I think she had said something like, oh, this is such a beautiful place to build a church. And to John Muir, he's thinking, you want to build a church inside of a church. It doesn't make any sense. And so he's illustrating with that quote that, how could you bring that modern East Coast American religious view into the wilderness and think it's more holy, more better than what's already here in the Yosemite? And it's just one of those most fascinating things to me about Muir is he was a very deep human being.
And we also have some other historical figures. Edward Abbey, he was park ranger, anarchist apparently.
Abbey is legendary in the West. He was I don't know how to describe him. He was like John Muir in the sense that he had an absolute reverence for the wilderness. I I mean, we're talking about a man who would frequently just wander off into the desert without even water or maps. He was famous for just wandering off. He once got lost in the Grand Canyon for 11 days because his boat sank and he didn't have a map and he had no shoes. And he just eventually wandered himself out of the area. Um, he worked in the Park Service at Arches National Park for quite a while. Um, he was a prolific writer. He's an alumni of the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque. He studied philosophy and literature there, and this would have been in the 1940s and 50s. He had a huge anti-government view. Everything he did. To illustrate that, the best story I can think of about Abbey is his death. And when he died, he had specifically instructed his friends to take him out into the middle of the Arizona desert and bury him with strict disregard for all federal and state laws regarding burial. And so, as such, he wanted to be buried in a sleeping bag in the middle of the desert. And they did that. They buried him in a. There are people who still roam the Sonoran Desert today trying to find his grave. It is marked, but it's no one has found it yet. And I think only one of the three people that knew where it was is still alive today. He was very outspoken about that sort of thing, and his book, Desert Solitaire, is probably his most known book, which is kind of almost like a journal of his experience working at Arches and Canyonlands National Park in the 1960s. But the Monkey Wrench Gang, which is just one of his novels, is the inspiration for the modern eco-terrorist movement. The going out. He talks about in the book some of the stories that his characters get into are things he actually did in northern New Mexico with his friends, where they would go out and they would take big wrenches and rip bolts out of the oil wells so that they would break down, and the oil company would have to come out and fix them. And they would continually do this and pull up stakes every time there was land development, and so the company would have to spend thousands of dollars to come back out and resurvey the area. He was very, very much kind of an inspiration for what we think of today as people like Greenpeace, or I forget the guys that have the TV show that go after the Japanese whalers. I can't remember his name, but that kind of mentality is very much Edward Abbey's life.
And there's also John Wesley Powell,
Yes,
who explored the Grand Canyons, Civil War veteran, Stephen Mather, father of the National Park Service and its first
Yes.
director. So Muir kind of lit the fuse on that one, so to speak, and Mather kind of came along and...
Well, what Muir did was he created the idea of taking land and setting it aside, not for the rich, not for the elite, not for the government, but for the people to enjoy. There's a great documentary Ken Burns had put together called America's National Parks, America's Best Idea, I think. It was on PBS in the late 2000s. And he goes into a lot of these histories, and Muir's goal had just been to set these aside for the people. In Europe, they talked about how a lot of the national treasures really were owned by the rich. The castles, the historic sites were owned by rich families in the 1800s. And here in the United States, it wasn't going to be that way. It was going to be different. And Mather is actually important because he is the brainchild behind the actual Park Service itself, because the national parks had been growing and had been being administered for, I think, 50-some years by this point. Well, no, not quite that long. 20 to 30 years by this point. And Mather comes along and says, we need an organization under the Department of the Interior that's responsible for the parks, because at the time, most of them had no funding. There was no funding at all. In fact, one of the most awesome pieces of history to read is the earliest protectors of Yosemite National Park were the African American Buffalo Soldiers, who after the Civil War had basically no job anymore. They were only left in the army out of compassion at the time, and they were sent west basically to guard the parks as an excuse just to get them, just here, go do something. And so they ended up being the earliest protectors from poachers, and when the gold rush began, prospecting and so on. Um, and so Mather, comes along and he comes up with an entire hierarchy for how the service will work, what it means to be an employee, what the idea of a ranger itself. Um, so he's very much loved. He also helped to set aside even more land in the 1930s, 40s, and so on. Uh, he was very well liked on Capitol Hill as well. He knew how to play the game in Washington, so he knew how to squeeze extra funding out. He knew how to garner the favor he needed to get the job done. He was known as being a go-getter and an accomplisher of tasks when given it. So, a very important part of the service's history.
Now, Powell, he was a Civil War veteran. He explored the Grand Canyon. How besides exploring, I'm assuming if it weren't for him, we wouldn't have the park regarding the Grand Canyon as well.
Well, no, I think the Grand Canyon was established right around the turn of the century. John Wesley Powell kind of helped to bring that interest to the Arizona, Southern California desert area. Up until that point, the parks had been focused on places like the Yosemite and Yellowstone. They're the two oldest. And these are places that are very much mountainous, heavy forested, lots of water. People, trees and rolling hills. People wanted to go see these things, and there wasn't a huge push to go look at red rock and dust in the desert. Powell's story is amazing because he was, I believe, the first to take a float trip down the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon, and he did so with only one arm. He lost an arm in the in the Civil War. I was trying to pull up his page here because I've forgotten a few things about him that we needed to know. Yeah. So yeah, he was. He also served as the second director for the U.S. Geological Survey, which is what put him into this more explorer, conserver type role. He did die in 1902, about 7 years before John Muir died. So I'm not sure if they knew each other, but
Their paths very well could have crossed at some point.
Absolutely. Muir started in California, but he would eventually go to Alaska, and he would his impact in the early 1900s would still be felt in the 1960s and 70s when Alaskans were resisting the Department of the Interior's wishes to make national parks in Alaska. There were in the 1960s and 70s in Alaska, many of the town's eating establishments had signs that said Park Service employees will be shot on sight. There was a huge lashback against what they saw as a federal land grab. Most Alaskans at the time were much more interested in the oil exploration. Because they thought it would bring them the money and wealth to the area. It turns out in the end that the parks, did get solidified, did get established, and it turns out they brought them 10 times the amount of money that the oil industry ever would have. So you don't find too many people in Alaska anymore that are all that upset about it anymore. But I mean, Muir's original expeditions in Alaska would set the stage for that to come 60 years later.
So, So Alaskans were initially opposed to the idea of national parks,
Well, it
and
wasn't
then
necessarily that they were opposed to the parks. They just Alaska, was one of the I believe it was the last to become a state. Either it was that or Hawaii. I'm a bad American. I should know the answer to that.
don't
But
feel bad. There were some things you had to correct me on too. So,
I
um,
think it was Alaska is the last one to become a state. I believe it was 1951. And it was to them. It was just they saw this as not that they were trying to set aside land, but that the federal government was trying to grab land. And Alaska had a very frontier mentality of we don't want the government here. We don't want the Park Service here. They're just an arm of the government. This was the 1960s as well. It was a very big conservative stronghold in the U.S. was Alaska. Um, and these issues go throughout the whole West. It's not just limited to Alaska. We've seen this recently. It was 1 or 2 years ago. The Cliven Bundy guy out in Nevada. This was the same mentality. Excuse me, same mentality. The same kinds of things were happening in Alaska when the Park Service was trying to establish gates of the Arctic and Kenai fjords and so on, Glacier Bay.
and every now and then you hear stories of government suing ranchers
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
who had open grazing rights since like the
Oh, absolutely.
1800s and royally screwing things up and saying, "Oh, we're going to fine you. We're going to make sure you're in trouble and everything else," even though they were actually fixing things that would have actually been good for the environment
Well,
at the time, too.
to clarify something, that's a huge issue, especially here in New Mexico. Um, 9 times out of 10, that's usually the Bureau of Land Management that gets into those fights. You very rarely ever see this happening at like the National Park Service or the Forestry Service. It's usually
Right.
land management because their job is much more, in looking at land entirely. But there's all. I mean, we were on geologic field expedition in Alamogordo last year, and for Fall Field Conference, and a rancher had led us onto his land to look at some rocks, and I remember him coming out with a gun, with a revolver on his hip in stereotypical New Mexico fashion, and saying, "You see an endangered species on this property, you will not utter one word about it to anyone, or I will come and find you." And he was quite serious. It's a problem. Anytime an endangered lizard or toad or whatever gets found, BLM swarms that area, and usually it ends with the rancher losing his land. And so they're very, um, you know, uppity about it. And so it was kind of like, oh, okay, we don't say anything. All right. So never saw anything, but, you know.
But do you think there's sometimes a little bit where people who want to preserve land go too far and endanger other people's livelihoods at the same time as well? Maybe more
Well,
balance is needed, or
the problem is that here in the West, I'm a transplant. I'm originally from the same area you're from central Missouri, from the Midwest, and these issues are not present there in the same way. Out here, the mentality has always been this way. This is a harsh place to live. It's not for the timid. It's not the easiest place to make a living. A lot of people come out here and die. In the 1800s, it was because they just didn't know how to survive. Today, it's because of drugs. But but in terms of your question, I think that when it comes to people conserving lands, I have yet to encounter anything that, in my personal opinion, is going too far. When it comes to the BLM wanting to exert control over land, I think that they do, in times, get greedy and want to soak up as much land as possible. On the same hand, though, the West is becoming more populated today than it ever had been in the past. And those cultures are really clashing now, where the people who are, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth generation Arizona natives, Utah natives, Nevada natives, understand why having protected land is important and they live with that, are butting into the fact that now Las Vegas and Phoenix and Los Angeles are metropolises with millions of people living in them, and the land is getting destroyed, desertified because of that push for water, which is, water. People still get murdered in New Mexico over water rights. If you go outside of Socorro, out towards Magdalena, out on the plains of San Agustin, out in the Gila, you will still encounter 1, 2, 3 murders a year that are probably motivated over water by ranchers. It's an actual thing that still happens. And so that pushback between those two cultures of progress, building cities, taming the desert, and then the people who have lived here who want to ranch and want to farm, is integral to understanding how the land management issue, how the BLM claiming land or taking land or giving land back even, which they do. People often, will go off and say, well, the BLM's always take. Sometimes they do give land back. They'll deregulate land that was protected to non-protected status, upon further surveys and so on. But yeah, I think in terms of when it comes to parks and monuments, no, I don't think that there is anything that has been detrimental to farmers. When it comes to BLM or reclamation, yeah, there absolutely have been.
Okay, and that's more along the lines of what I was.
Yeah.
I wasn't referring to parks. Oh no, I wasn't referring to parks that were already there. Yeah. More along the lines. You were describing the guy with the gun, saying, "Look, don't tell anybody this is there, because I will lose my livelihood, basically, if that happens."
There's some. I mean, usually what happens is the BLM, in a case of an endangered species, the BLM will come in and make a survey, and they'll say, it takes, who knows, 6 months, a year, I don't know, but whatever it ends up taking, they'll come back and say, well, we found the gray spotted lizard, and it is in danger, but we found 2 of them. So that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to give up your land, because they might have just wandered over here from this plot of land that nobody owns, so we're just going to take that, and we've relocated these 2 30 miles over here. There are times, though, when it pops up where there's a nest of rare falcons, we'll say, and it's like, oh, well, okay, you've got to give up this section of your land now. It's not like Russia. They don't just come in and just take it. There is compensation for that that is given, but it depends. I mean, if a rancher loses half of his ranch land, it's going to be really hard to ranch. If he loses 1/10 of his ranch land, well, it's just an annoyance, and usually they get over it, or they carry it like a grudge until they're 90 and die. But it's really case by case on how it works out here.
And the 2 clashing cultures, as you said, have not made this easily resolvable at times.
No, yeah, oh yeah. It's like I was saying about, you still have murder over water rights here. A great example, something I just recently learned, rain barrels, collection of rainwater in Colorado is illegal. And I was trying to figure out why. That doesn't make any sense, because here in New Mexico, it's one of the primary ways that we get our water. It turns out the reason for that is because in the 1800s, Colorado sold its water rights to California. So the water that falls from the sky literally belongs to California if it falls within the confines of the state of Colorado. And that's why you can't have a rain barrel, because it's not your water to collect. It's California's water. And I thought to myself, that's crazy. I had no idea that's what that was about.
Wow. So some places up in Oregon, I think there's problems doing that as well.
Yeah, well, California steals water from Oregon quite frequently. If you go to Southern California, you have Los Angeles. You have over 100 golf courses, and that is enough to suck up. It's not sustainable, but it sucks up a ton of water, and they have to get it from Northern California, from Nevada, from Arizona, from Oregon, even from Colorado. Um, it's quite actually a big issue. There are those people out there in academia that study things like water usage and hydrology and cities and how that interacts on a social level. And they have been saying for the last few decades that Los Angeles as a city is not sustainable and that it will collapse and then it will be half the size it is now because people will leave in droves because there won't be enough water to support it. And then they said, then it'll be a nice place to live. But it is a big central issue out here in the desert of sustainability when there's no water for. I mean, half the year the Rio Grande River is just 2 miles that way out the front of my house door. Half of the year it's dry. I can walk in the middle of the river and not get wet. um, that's how life is in the desert. When it rains, it fills up. But
so basically, those who've been arguing that it's stupid legislation that's going to kill most of California's population because they're going to move away. No, it's unsustainability of water.
Yeah,
in large cities.
It's not an issue of the legislation is going to drive people from California. It's just that it's not sustainable. I mean, Dubai in the United Arab Emirates is another example of this. Dubai is a jewel in the middle of a desert that's far more harsh than what we live in here in the southwest United States. And when the oil does eventually dry up, Dubai will become a ghost town. That Burj Khalifa, the tallest building in the world, will just be nothing but a rusted monument because there won't be a reason for anyone to be there anymore. There won't be any more money flowing into the area for people to continue to maintain that lifestyle, and it will degrade. And the same thing will happen in Los Angeles eventually. Phoenix, too. Probably not Albuquerque. Albuquerque's quite a bit smaller and higher in the mountains and has more access to water. But when you get into the Sonoran and the Mojave deserts, where it's much more like a real desert than it is here where we're at, those cities will eventually stop growing.
So it's going to be interesting to see what happens 10 to 15 years from now.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Because somewhere saw a glimpse of headlines saying scientists are warning that California has about 1 year of water left, and I'm wondering if they included the fact that they own water rights to Colorado.
Well, they don't because it's such a convoluted mess of figuring out where the water in California comes from because they have water rights in so many places. I mean, the thing about California is that they're in an extreme drought and have been for about 10 years. And it should have gotten better, but El Nino didn't show up like we thought it would last year. And it will eventually show up, but the question is when? Another 3 years? This is the second year in a row that Reclamation is telling Southern California farmers that there's no water. You're not getting any because we're not allowing you to take any out of the reservoir. So any water they get is going to have to come from a source that they either mine themselves, so they dig their own wells to get water out of the aquifer, which is drained very, very, very low, or they're going to have to truck it in to keep their farms going. And I think you'll see a lot of farming in Southern California. A lot of farmers this year will just give up and they'll move because I don't think it's not going to be profitable for them anymore. And to be honest, it probably needs to be this way because you shouldn't be farming in the middle of the freaking Mojave Desert anyway. But
changing environment and everything like that.
Right.
And it once was a very good environment to farm a lot of fruit and things like that, but unfortunately times change and not being able to adapt.
Foresight. You go back to the 1940s and 50s and there was no regard for policy. It was just suck all the water up, make the farms, make the food. We're fighting World War II. We need the fruits and vegetables. There was no um, responsibility or accountability to the use of the resource. And as it got into the 1980s, and we're of course no longer fighting in World War II anymore. It's been 30 years by that point, 35 years by that point, and the scientists start doing modern science on the area and finding out, look, the aquifer is dangerously low, and it's not getting recharged. We're not getting snowfall like we used to. You can tie this in, of course, to climate change. It's regardless of whether humans cause climate change or not, it is changing, and people are going to suffer the effects of that change. In California, Southern California is a prime example of where it will happen in terms of drought.
So, so in addition to parks not getting funded, you have this happening out in California.
I would argue
Um,
politics in the West, in the American West, are more difficult, confusing, and corrupt than they are on the East Coast because of all of these issues. So many hands and so many different pockets out here, especially when it comes to water or land, that it gets really hard to tell who's really out to help who.
oh man,
Yeah,
that's
and it's not
and
new. It's been like this since the 1800s, so it's like normal everyday uh, thing here for us.
so. What are you recommending for trying to convince people to actually care and not destroy these monuments or
The first
pollute them?
Right. Well, the first thing I would say is this: is to know, to don't just take my word for it, but go out there and do the research on these issues. But also know that these places like the Grand Canyon, places like the Southwest, these are loved places, and there are millions of people here that are already doing things to help. And so this is not I am not this is not an issue of, oh my God, we have to do something in the next 10 years or the entire Southwest is going to burn up. I don't think that's the case. What people can do, volunteer for your park service, first of all. It's great for you because being outside is great. It really reduces stress. Get out there and interact with people who are coming into the parks. They need the help. Volunteering is great because if you decide you want to try to pursue a career in the Park Service does prefer to hire people they've worked with before. So if you volunteered at several different places, you can put that on your resume, and you're more apt to get hired than somebody who just walks in off the street and says, "I need a job." So it's great for you in that regard if you want to maybe start a career in the Department of the Interior or the Park Service, Forest Service, what have you. It's also good for your health, like I said. It's good to be out in the parks. It's good to support. It's good to see the positive. Whenever I go into the parks, I very rarely see people fighting. In fact, I don't ever think I've even seen a fight. I don't encounter rude people. Everyone seems to be pretty happy to be there. So it's a positive place to go, and that's what it should be. As far as what you can do to help with issues like water management and things like that is don't move here. Or if you have to move here, don't bring all 70 of your relatives with you because we're running out of that ability to sustain a lot of people. And I realize I moved here 5 years ago, so I'm part of the problem, but I'm only one person. Hopefully that won't be too bad. Um, but the other thing is we talked a little bit earlier. The Park Service does need a bit more funding. I don't think that they need a ton of it. I think um, my hope is that after the next presidential election, we'll get a different administration. And I don't know that much about how politics works, to be honest. But I can say that hopefully the next administration, whoever they may be, will be easier to work with Congress. And maybe then somebody can get something done. Stuart Udall, who was Secretary of the Department of the Interior in the 1960s, is a famous New Mexico politician. His nephew, Tom Udall, is our current senator, and you may know of him. He's been leading the fight against Citizens United for several years. He's also takes his relative Stewart's stance on conservation very highly. So he often argues in Congress, lobbies Congress for bills pertaining to parks and conservation. So there are people out there who can do it. It's just a matter of helping to get legislation, good legislation, not just any old thing written, but good stuff passed. Getting involved, I used to ask people to get involved with the Sierra Club. I don't do that anymore because, like most modern political organizations, they've kind of become so entrenched in far left liberal stuff that I don't agree with half of what they say these days. So I tend to shy away from asking. If you want to support something, support the parks with your money by going and visiting the parks and going into the bookstore and buy. They have wonderful history and geology and science books in the store. They're high quality. That's the best. If you want to give your money, do it that way. Paying the entrance fee to get into a park. I don't know how much of it goes to these organizations, how much ends up in the parks, but I would guess very little.
I was going to ask, besides that, is there currently a way for people to directly donate to these parks to where they have more funding from private citizens, and as opposed to relying on legislators who may or may not add poison pills to...
Right. So I believe the Western National Park Association has been able to avoid political corruption so far. I think you can still donate to them. The Park Foundation, which was started by who started the Park Foundation? They're good to do. I'm trying to remember who started the Park Foundation, but
Stephen,
they are. Huh?
Stephen, is that Mather or no?
I think it was Mather, but it might have actually been the Rockefellers. So I'm gonna. It was Roy Hampton Park. It's the Park Foundation, founder and chairman of Park Communications. He was a journalist in the 1940s. Anyway, the Park Foundation still does a lot of good with their money, and they help. And then, of course, like I said, visit the parks. Paying those fees is one of the best things you can do. The other thing is, when a new park is brought up for proposal, comment on it. A lot of times here in New Mexico, we get new areas every year. Sometimes they're really small. Our senators always send out things all over the social media saying, what are your comments on this? So be active in that part of politics. Just make your comments known. Say, I support such and such wilderness because I think that, and don't just do it because I'm telling you to, but look, is making this area in, let's say, your state protected? Is it good for you? If it is, then support it. If it's not, then don't. But that's another way you can do it. Outside of that, they've made it really hard to publicly fund a lot of these agencies. Like with NASA, there used to be calls, can the public donate to NASA? It's not that easy to do. It's easier for the Park Service, not that easy for some things like NASA or the USGS. But the other thing is, I would say, another way you can help with funding issues is when you go to parks, don't do stupid things. Don't give the Park Service a reason to have to spend money because of your ignorance or because of your stupidity. So things like vandalism, that costs money. Cleaning the saguaros, which we talked about early on in this podcast today, I believe cost like $50,000 a cactus, and there were several dozen that had to be cleaned. Cleaning the rocks altogether, I think, was $20,000 or $30,000, and that takes money right out of the coffers. And to people who say, well, that doesn't sound like a lot, for the Park Service right now it is. And the reason is, you have to remember, the Park Service is a part of the BLM, the Forestry Service, the U.S. Geological Survey, which are all under the Department of the Interior. So unlike NASA, which gets funded every year for 20 billion, let's say, the Department of the Interior gets funded for 20 billion, but it has 4 or 5 departments that get all that funding under it. Whereas NASA, there's nothing under NASA to suck up that parts of that funding. So it ends up being very little in the end that helps out for them. Those are some of the ways I would suggest.
Okay. And
No.
why?
Sorry, just turn on a light.
Do you think it would be a good idea to make it even easier for individuals to directly donate?
I don't know. I think the thing is that in a way you can already kind of do that, and I can't believe I forgot about this. Every park, every monument, when you go there and visit, has a glass box that you can donate money to, and that money goes directly into the Park Service, and there is an actual accountability for that money. So there are public reports released every quarter where you can go and see how much was collected from the box, what it was spent on. It's usually spent on trail maintenance. It's usually spent on visitor center maintenance or facilities maintenance, so you know that it's not going into someone's pocket. When it does go into someone's pocket, it's usually pay for new rangers, for new law enforcement, for new visitor center guides, and that I don't care. If it's good now, if it's going in to make the salary of the Department of the Interior Secretary bigger, then I would, but it doesn't. At least it hasn't yet. So that is there. So I guess in that way they can go and do that in person. I don't know if they accept online donations or not. I don't think they do at the current time. And I don't know if that would make a huge amount of difference because, like I said, the biggest problem really is the amount of usage and the people not using wisely. When people go camping and they carelessly leave a fire going, and then all of a sudden you have a 3,000, 4,000 acre fire in Yosemite, I mean, that's millions of dollars that it's going to, tens of millions probably, that it's going to blossom into. So a lot of what can save the Park Service money is, people being smart when they use the parks. Don't take things out of the park when you come in. We have a mantra. When you go to the parks, when you enter the parks, you take only, when you leave the parks, you take only photographs and you leave only footprints. It's kind of a cute little thing we teach to the children in the visitor centers and things when they come in. Don't take out rocks and sticks and pine cones, because if everybody did it, eventually there wouldn't be anything left. And that kind of damage that causes is just, sometimes it's not even fixable, no matter how much money you have. For the border, if you live in the border parks, I believe there are 2 border parks in the U.S., Big Bend in Texas and Organ Pipe in Arizona. Just report illegal activity. If you see people crossing the border for whatever reason and it looks suspicious, don't engage them, but report that to law enforcement so that can be taken care of, because only in the last year has all of the trails in Organ Pipe been opened up again. Arizona did a lot of combating there at the park to stop the border crossings and to stop the killings of rangers in the area, and it has worked, and it's getting better. But having a park shut down, that decreases the economy in the whole area, because you don't have people coming in. The same thing with Petroglyph. I was just looking. I think all the trails are back open now, but it was shut down for a couple of years because of all the vandalism. And fixing vandalism aside, costing money. When a park's not open, it's not making any money for itself, and it's not making any money for the local economy. No one's coming to the restaurants, the hotels. There's no reason to, because you can't get into the park. So really taking a stance against illegal activity is a way to help save money in the park system. Being responsible when using the parks is a way to help save money. Encouraging people to go and responsibly use the parks and the monuments is also a way, because the more people we get in, now, like I said, the double-edged sword, the more damage we are opening ourselves up to, but the more economy raising money we're opening ourselves up to.
Should there be an off season for parks every now and then? Have kind of a rotating kind of schedule to where it gives them time to recuperate, or what?
Well, they kind of do that. Most parks usually close in the winters for several months between the official park season. So if you get a job as a park ranger, for example, it usually starts on March 1st and ends on October 1st, and then after that you don't work anymore. There are exceptions. A lot of the parks here in Arizona, New Mexico are open year-round because we don't have horrible winters like you do back home. Or up north. But you do have that to some degree, and then there are times when parts of parks are shut down. Like, for example, I think Window Rock and Arches is shut down this year for trail maintenance and just general surveys and things. So you won't be able to do. There's a couple dozen trails you won't be able to use this year, and that will help, I think, a little bit. But I'm not sure that actually shutting them down will do that much from time to time to help out. I've heard an argument made on this too, that having more parks, there are 58 currently in the United States, having more would even out the distribution of what people are going to and using. This is kind of hard for me because emotionally it's like, hell yeah, I'd sign me up for more parks. More beautiful land everywhere, I'll take it. But on a responsible level, I have to say now, we can't just go picking any random grove of trees and saying that's a park, and that's a park, and that's a park, and that's a park. We have to be responsible about it. It is true, though, people do like to point out that if you go into a certain area of the United States, there basically aren't any parks there, and there are probably places that are beautiful and should be preserved. And that area, of course, is the south, east, in the United States. There are a lot of historic sites and monuments, but nothing really grand. I mean, people don't go to Alabama and think, oh, I'm going to see Alabama's version of the Grand Canyon. I don't know if there even is a landmark that would be that recognizable in a place like Alabama or Georgia. But those areas could benefit, and it would be nice to see a couple of new parks pop up in that area of the country, because right now, outside of Florida, there's not really much of a park presence there outside of, like I said, the historic sites and the battlefields and so on.
And there'd have to be considerations for property owner rights and
Exactly.
avoiding the abuse of eminent domain, which has happened throughout the country from time to time on state government's parts.
Exactly.
So there's that to consider.
There's also the issue of in the South, the poverty, the racial tensions. It's not a place that a lot of people want to go. I mean, I'm not trying to be an ass by saying that, but I very rarely hear people say, I'm going to go to Alabama on vacation. Because why? It's just not the nicest place to go.
In all honesty, there are people who will tell you stay away from certain parts of Oklahoma. It's like being in another country.
Right.
Stay away from the non-metropolitan parts of Arkansas. It can get a little bit scary. It's just so it's also that kind of stuff to take into consideration too. It's
and the economies are not great in that area. The health in that area is not the greatest. There's a lot of obesity and so on, and so it's just I honestly think that area could benefit from having 2 or 3 national parks. Big tracts of place. It would help the economies. It would help the people. I think it would be great. I don't know that I can't find anything here in a quick Google search of anything current proposed in the area. I found some little proposed monuments. The difference between a park and a monument, by the way, is is simply in designation. The national monuments are usually smaller tracts of land, although they don't have to be, than the parks. And they're not quite as advertised as parks. They're a little bit, usually monuments are attached to what are called national wildernesses. And a wilderness is just a tract of land that has no development. There is no visitor center. There are no hiking trails. If you go there, you make your own trail. Usually you pay an $8 permit to go camping in the backcountry for 7 days, and that's it. And if you get lost, well, you're probably going to die because there's no one here to help you. There are a couple of areas like that have been proposed, but nothing big. And I think, people, that's another thing I want to touch on if we've got time. People think of the Park Service and they think to themselves, well, the Grand Canyon, Yosemite, Yellowstone, you've got the Saguaro, you've got Olympic. They don't realize that the Park Service is responsible for 400, 500, 600 of the nation's historical landmarks. The Capitol, the National Mall, is part of the Park Service. That's run by the park. We know that because in 2013 when we had the partial government shutdown and they had all the signs up, you couldn't go visit Lincoln Memorial, and people were jumping signs, and there were all these poor park rangers that were like, I have to stand here and tell you this, but don't really agree with it, but I got no choice. It's my job. So historic battlefields, historic rivers, national landmarks what is this? It's Liberty? Is that up there north of Kansas City? No, Independence. That's the city I'm thinking of. Independence has the Harry S. Truman Home, which is a National Historic Site, which is beautiful. I've been there. It's a great little home to visit. The library, Truman Library, is there. You've got several. Lone Jack outside of Lee Summit has a national battlefield there. So, that is another side of the Park Service that people tend to forget about, is that we set aside not only beautiful land, but pieces of American history. And they're important to us because, that's our history. That's where we came from. So, visit those sites as well if you can.
And I've been to the site in question, Lone Jack. So
yeah.
But I think we're pretty much both talked out on this subject at the moment. So, kind of skipped this past Friday. We're recording on a Saturday because my birthday came up, and I
was deadly sick all week.
So this one will be updated to the feed this coming Friday. So thank you for joining us again, Curtis. I'm going to try to get get Stephen Kelly back on here. It's been a long time since he's been on here.
For the video part of this, one last little thing I wanted to do here. If you go to your national parks, you can get one of these. I believe they're $10, $9.99. I got mine 5 years ago, so the price may have gone up. But what these are, this is the passport to the parks, and inside is all kinds of information. I don't know how easy it is to see on every park, every monument, everything in the system. And there are places all through it where you can get your stamps. When you visit a park, each ranger desk has a stamp that has the park on it. And so it's like a passport for visiting other countries for the parks. This is a great way to support the Park Service and to kind of record your memories of traveling there. So I highly recommend the service. Actually, all the profits from these go back into the Park Service. So it's a good investment. It's not expensive, and it'll bring you a lot of fun and joy. So for those who can see it, that's what it looks like. If you're listening to this on the audio version, you just go to any ranger, any visitor center, any national park monument, and they'll have them, and you can ask for one.
Oh.
And they're high quality too. They're really good. Mine's held up very well, having been in hiking backpacks and dropped over cliffs and all kinds of stuff.
At least you haven't fallen off a cliff over it.
Yeah, I haven't fallen yet. Hopefully I won't.
Well, entertain yourself, educate yourself, empower yourself. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Peace.